So in this iteration, we'll discuss the statistics screen. So stats screen in iteration 9. Problem formulation. First, the scope. So the scope here is display statistics data on the game, including we have 4 that I'm gonna go with. You can add to that as well. Highest to score so far, lowest to score so far, recent to score, and number of games played. How many games have been played? How do we test this? Testing scenario 1. We're gonna play a game and observe that the scores have changed. So the number of games played should update every time you play a game, and the highest score should reflect the highest score so far. So we need to play a game and score high and see if the highest score persists. Similarly, for the lowest score, play a game and score low and see if the score persists, and likewise the recent score. So I'm gonna go with my first test. I will start the app and play a game and score 33. Observe that all score stats will be 33. Since this is the first time, the highest, the lowest, and the recent will be the same. And number of games played is 1. Then we have testing scenario 2. And in many cases, you can do that in an Excel sheet that says the test, the input, what you're going to do, what the app should do, and then the notes or the result, what actually happened. So we'll do another one and score 66. So now we're changing the highest score. So play a game, play another game, and score 66. Observe that the highest score and recent score are now 66, and number of games played is 2. Then we can do another scenario where we score 0. So we notice that the lowest score should shift. So play another game and score 0. Observe that the highest score remains at 66. The lowest now changes to 0, and recent is 0, and number of games is 3. You probably can think now that there are many possibilities, and you are correct. We discussed that before. So we now play another game and score 100. Observe that the highest score is now 100, the lowest remains at 0, and recent is 100. Number of games played is now 4. Then if you play another one and make like maybe 33, so TS5, repeat TS1, but observe that this time the highest score remains at 100, lowest remains at 0, and recent is a 33, and number of games played is 5. And so on and so forth. You can test different scenarios and make sure that all the different possibilities are covered in making sure the app accomplishes the designed scope. So how are we going to accomplish this? That's the solution formulation step. We have the model, the data, and in the model here we have additional information. We have highest score, lowest score. The recent score is the same as we used before, what we call the score in the previous iteration, and then we have the number of games played. So we need add variables to hold data for highest score, lowest score, and number of games played. score is already stored. Now, in the model here, we have a challenge that we need to persist this data throughout the game. So we need to save it. When the user is done playing, we need that data saved. So where are we going to save the data? In the next project, we'll learn how we can open a file on the actual device and write data to that file. In this project, we learn to take advantage of a shared object or a common object called UserDefaults, which is an object that the operating system maintains and make available for the application to store data in it. So we will use the UserDefaults object to store the data. The UserDefaults holds its data in memory. I believe in the most recent operating system it now saves to the device as well, so it persists, but it can only hold data in the primitive form, so you can't put images or arrays or things like that. By saving the data in that object, not only do we persist it or preserve it from one game to the other, we also make it available to the stats screen. In the document called the music learning.pdf, which is on Blackboard, when I discuss what the challenge in passing the data, we now have a status screen that will display the statistics. However, the statistics depend on the score and the games that are being played, which take place in the game controller. So we discussed this problem in module number 2 when we created a color in one screen and we wanted to use that color in another screen. And we said that each screen is an isolated island, does not know anything about the previous screen. So you have to actually move the data yourself manually from one to the other. In project number 2, we learned about one mechanism, which is using the segue that connects the first screen to the other, and use the prepare for segue event to assign data from the first screen to objects in the second screen. In this module, we introduce another method that can be used to move data from one screen to the other, which is using the standard UserDefaults. The standard UserDefault is like a table, as you can see here, and the table has a key and a value. Remind you with dictionary, it is very similar to the structure of a dictionary. So the idea here is that the standard UserDefault is managed by the operating system, so it lives beyond your particular app. So it persists and it exists for the app to access. So if the game controller accesses the standard UserDefaults and put the data in it, it will stay in the standard UserDefault. At a later time, or whenever you need to display it, you go to the stats screen, and the stats screen then accesses the same standard UserDefault and download the data from there. The only key consideration for the game controller and the stats screen to connect correctly is that both of them need to access the same key. So the key that the game controller used to store the data or read the data has to be exactly the same key that the statistics controller will use to access and to use this data. So we'll use the standard UserDefault mechanism to store the data between the two screens. Then the view. No changes on the game screen for the view, but now we need to build the stats screen. And we have the mockup, and the mockup has the stats screen, looks like that, a very simple view, displaying the statistics as numbers. You can also display the statistics as bar charts. That can be an enhancement that you can do on your own. A bar chart, if you think about it, is just a rectangle, and you just need to start the rectangles, all of them at one point, and then change the height of the rectangle. So if you are able to place a rectangle as a shape or object at height 70, and then you put next to it a score of 10 and 15 and 50, you can display this data as rectangles, at least for the scores. You can display the games played as counters. You can use images for the numbers, or you can use just a simple label as I have here. So there's a lot of room of you to enhance and improve that section of the display of the data. But the stats screen need, and you can either have just one label that has 4 lines, as you can see here, or you can put 4 labels and each of them has a different title. The advantage of using 4 labels is you're able to give each one of them a different color, a different font, and so on. If you use one label, they all gonna be the same font, the same color, and so on and so forth. So that's the view. So we'll say see the mockup screen or the app mockup. And then the last one is the controller. So there is work to be done on the game screen, and there's work the game controller, and there's work to be done on the stats controller. On the game controller, again, the 2 questions for every controller is when and what. When do you want to do the functionality, and what functionality do you want to have? So here, in the game controller, the functionality I want to do is to update the statistics, because every time you play a game, you come up with at least the number of games played changes. Every time you play, that statistic record changes. So every time you play, you need to update the statistics. So when do you update the statistics? Do you update it at the beginning of the game, during the game, or at the end of the game? In the previous video or previous iteration, we decided to calculate the score at the end of the game. So this means that I'm able to update the statistics only at the end of the game. So we'll say here that in the game controller, we need to update the statistics record at the end of the game. So the end of the game is the end game function. So in the end game function, we need to update the statistics, and I'm going to create another function called update stats and give that other function the responsibility to update those statistics. You want each function to have one concept that it works with or plays with. So since the updating statistics is like a unique standalone concept, you don't want to confuse it inside the end game. So we make a function for it, but then that function needs to be linked from the end game, so it is not an orphan function that nobody's connected to it. In the stats controller, what we want to do in the stats controller, we want to get the data from the user defaults object and display it in the label. So when do we want to do that? The moment the user moves to the stats screen. So at the display or download and display, download and display the stats when the stat screen loads. So we have the function viewDidLoad. We've used it before. This is the function that captures that event that view now has loaded. In that function, we can retrieve the statistics from the user default and display it to the user. So the last part is the implementation, solution implementation. And in that step, we again, with the stuff we're gonna do in the game controller and the stuff on the stats controller, you can start with either one of those. It doesn't really matter. I'm gonna start with the game controller and the screen, nothing on the screen. So in the game controller, create update stat function, create and implement. And then in the also modify the end game to call the update stat. Then in the stat screen, we need to add the labels, label or labels, whatever you want, and connect to the controller. And then update the view did load to download and display the stats. Okay. So let's go ahead and do that. So first, in the view controller, which is our game screen, here is our end game, and we need to add the update stats function. So I come here and create a new function called update stats, and no parameters, no return value. And then in the end game function, once I'm calculated the score and presented the alert, I update the stats. So I say update stat, and I'm gonna do it right now so that I don't forget. Oftentimes, if you build the update stat, you forget that you have to link it from the end game. So what do I need to do in the update stats? Step number one, because the first time you play the game, there's or the game is opened on a device, there will be no stats in the user defaults. However, after you play the game for the first time, these 4 values will be added to the user defaults. So if you play the game regularly, the first thing you want to do for updating the stat is to retrieve the data that's already there. Then you increment or update that data, then you save it again. So to update the stats, I need to retrieve the stats from the user defaults. Then I need to update the stats. Then I need to save the stats back to the user default. The updated stats. So how do I retrieve the stats from the user defaults? The object for the user default called NS user default, and you can look that up in the documentation and API. If you go to Window, Documentation and API, S user defaults. User defaults. So there is NS user defaults, but it's taking us to the controller. User defaults. So there's no NS in it, so it's just user defaults, and that's with the this is with the new iOS 8 Plus. Before that, it was called NS user default, so now it's called just user defaults. Use this to read the defaults that your application uses from users default database. So we can get a reference to standard user default, so that's the standard. Returns the shared defaults object, so that's what we want to use. And then we start to add data to the default, so we can add a string, we can add integer, so this is the function to return integer, or we can use set integer for key to set an integer value for a key. So we'll say here let share, I'm going to call it shared object because that's the function it's going to use, and we'll call user defaults dot standard. So that gives you the standard user defaults object. Then I need to retrieve the data there in variables that will change. So I start, maybe let's start with just one of them for now to see the whole cycle working, and then update later on. So we'll say variable highest score equal share the object dot, and then we'll use integer for key. Now the first time, this is where I set the name I'm gonna use. So I'm gonna use highest score with no spaces and first letter uppercase. This is gonna be critical because anytime I wanna access that to set the value or to retrieve it in the stats screen, that's the one I need to use. Now that I retrieved the highest score, I need to update it. So how do I update it? The highest score will remain the same, no update, unless the score is higher. So if the current score, the value in the score variable is higher than the value I got from the highest score, then I need to make an update. If it is not higher, then I should not do anything. So then before I update the highest score, I need to put a condition. If the score is higher than the highest score, then I need to create a true block, and inside the true block I reset the highest score to equal the score, because if the score is higher, then I need to drop the score that's currently existing in the highest score and add. So the very first time the app is loaded, you're gonna try to retrieve the variable, the integer variable associated with the key highest score. But the very first time there is no key called highest score. So you're gonna get back the default value for integer, which is 0. So highest score will have that 0. Then you're gonna compare the score that you have with the 0. So the score you have will be greater. Then you're gonna reset the highest score. Then after you update the highest score, you want to save it back to the stats. So to save the highest score back, I need to use the set. So I say shared object dot set integer or set, and then I'm setting integer set, and then I need to set the highest score for key. Where is the function? It's not. I want the function to come so that I can, yeah, here it is. So I need to put the highest score for the key and then use exactly the same key. If you type different text for each of the keys, they're gonna create different records and you will not be accessing the same value. So that will update the stats for the highest score. In order for the user to see it, then we need to add it on the stats screen. So I'm going to take just the highest score and finish the entire cycle, then so that you can see the whole process. Then we go back and redo it for the current score, the number of games played, and the lowest score. So I need to add the label. So I'm going through these steps here in the game controller and then the stats screen. I'm going through these steps, but I'm going through it with one variable, which is the highest score. So I need to go to the stats screen and maybe make it look nice, so I can change the white color to something and add a label. So add a label, and this will be the label for the highest score. And you can give it a color, you can give it a font size, all of that stuff. So I'm gonna give it maybe this color. I don't want the label to be there, and I will leave this as is, and you can center it or leave it as you have now, and it's just gonna say highest score equal and then the score. Then once we added that, I need to connect it to the status screen. So here is my status screen, and I need to connect it. Maybe I'll hide these two so you can see. Here is my status screen and here is my stat controller. I need to connect this label as an outlet. So I connect it here as an outlet, and I'm gonna call it label highest score. Then to display the highest score in that label, I don't need this mark navigation, so delete that. I'm gonna update the view.did.load. So I go inside the view.did.load and say I want to display the highest score. So that's gonna happen in two steps. The first step is similar to what we had before. Retrieve the highest score from the user defaults. And then step 2, display the highest score in the label. So I go first and retrieve it. So by saying let shared object equal UserDefaults dot standard, then I'll say let highest score equal shared object, and then I will retrieve it using the integer for key, and then use exactly the same key with the same spelling, same uppercase, lowercase, and everything that you have. Now that you have the highest score, we can display it, but the label only displays a string. So we say label highest score dot text equal. So I can put a string that says highest score equal, and then I can use the injection to inject the highest score value into that text like that. And then we can test and see. If you try to access the status screen in the beginning before you play any game, you're gonna get the default, because in the beginning, before you play any game, the highest score will try to, the status screen or controller will try to retrieve the highest score, but it will not find a highest score because there's nothing in there. You haven't played the game yet. So you're gonna get a 0, nothing in there. It's integer, so you're gonna get a 0 for it, and we'll see. And then you play the game, and whatever score you're gonna have, that will be the highest score, and it can be updated. And we'll run through those tests now. So if you go to stats, here is highest score equal 0. There's nothing in there. And then let's play a game and make sure we score something correct. So here is 33. So let's keep it at that and answer incorrect the other two. So we're doing like testing scenario 1. We get a score of 33. Now if you go to the stats, now the highest score became 33. If you go back and play another game and maybe score 66 this time, you go back to the stat and you see that the highest score is now updated. All right? So then we need to repeat this for the others. Since we are here in the status screen, I can finish the rest of them. So here is, I can copy that. Actually, I'll add another one. Let me copy. So here is the second one, and I'll maybe give this a different color for now, and then connect it so I don't lose it. And this will be my lowest score. Then I make a third one and maybe give it another color and connect it, and this will be my current score. And then another one, and I'll give that a different color. And that will be the number of games played. I'm gonna call it label number of games. I didn't create them in the other screen yet, but I can add them here because the stats screen works directly with the user default, so I don't need the game screen for anything to get the stats screen working. It's just gonna give me 0 because nothing is put in here. But since I'm at it, I'm just gonna add them. So then after I retrieve the first one, the highest score, I do the same thing to retrieve the lowest score. So I'm gonna use the shared object integer, and then the key will be lowest score, and that's the key I'm gonna use in the other one. Then current score, I'm gonna use the same thing, integer and for key, and that will be current score. And then the last one is the number of games played, and this will be shared object integer, and I'm gonna use number of games played. Then do the label here. So label lowest score dot text equal lowest score, and inject the value. Yeah. And then the current score text and inject the value. And then finally the number of games played. So now the status screen is capable of retrieving all the data. What is missing is we need to update the user default with this data. So I'll go back to the standard editor, go to my game controller, and as I updated the highest score, I'll go ahead and update the rest of them. So let me update first the current score. Now the current score replaces whatever you have, right? So I don't need to retrieve the current score because it's gonna be removed anyway. So I just need to, and I don't need to do any update. I just need to save the current score. So I say shared object that set, and what I'm setting here is the score, and what is the key I'm setting the score for is current score. That's the same key I used for the other one, because the score is what the current score is, the most recent one. There's no comparison, no changes, none of that. Then the next one, I'll do the number of games played, and that will change. So number of games played, and retrieve that. Number of games played. And this has to be exactly the same as what we used in the stat screen. Number of games played. You can even copy and paste so that you don't make a mistake. Now that we got the number of games played, updating the number of games played is easy. You just add 1 to it, right? Because the fact that I'm here, it means that we just ended a game. We come to the update stat at the end of a game. So it means that another counter need to be added. So I'll say number of games played equal number of games played, whatever number we have, plus 1. And then I need to save it back. So shared object that set, and this will be number of games played, and the key will be number of games played. The last one here is the lowest score, and we'll say shared object integer, and we want to retrieve the lowest score. Now the lowest score is a little bit tricky. You may think that the lowest score is exactly the same as the highest, but the other way around. So if the score that we have is less than the lowest score in the statistics, then I need to update that lowest score number. So I say if score is less than lowest score, so we'll say lowest score equal score. It's exactly the same as we did with the statistics. There is a catch here though. The very first time you play the game, you're gonna try to get the lowest score. There's no lowest score key in the user default, so you're gonna get back the default value for integer, which will be 0. So the first time you're gonna get a 0, but it's not a reflection that the user actually scored a 0. It's a 0 just because there's no value set in the user default. So So I need to, for the first case only, the first time you play the game, whatever the score you have is the lowest score, because that's the first time you played the game. Even if you score 100, the first time you play the game and you score 100, 100 is your lowest score. Then as you continue playing, the lowest score will change. So I need to add another condition for the very first time the game is played. So how do I know the very first time the game is played? The very first time the game is played, number of games played will equal 1. Because the very first time you're going to try to retrieve number of games played, you're going to get 0, and you're going to add 1 to it, so now you played it once. So if the number of games played equal 1, that means it's the very first time. And if that is the case, the lowest score must equal the score, regardless of anything. So I'll come here and add another condition that says, if the number of games played equal 1, then lowest score equal score. Then I need to save it. So I say shared object set lowest score, and the key will be lowest score. So let's try. So if you start, here are the initial values. So I told you that the data in the user default persist. So even though I deployed a new game, the data is still there. So my highest score there, but the others are all defaulted to 0 because they didn't exist. So let's play a game and try to get 1, so run testing scenario 1. Get 33. So the number of games played is 1. My lowest score now is 33, and the current score is 33. Then if I play this again and maybe get nothing wrong, nothing correct I mean, my lowest score should become 0 and should shift from that 30. Oops, I got one correct. So you'll see there will be no changes. So my lowest score is 33, my current is the same, but now I play it twice. So it is there, and my lowest score became 0. Now, when the lowest score is 0, that is the lowest ever. So it's not going to change because nobody can score lower than 0 in the way we have the scoring mechanism. So that's basically show you that we have completed the application, and it has the statistics and so on, but there are issues. The first issue is that if you start a game, you can keep clicking on the start game button. You can even play and then click start game again. So it's very confusing to the user. So one of the enhancements we want to do is to make sure that you start the game only once. Then you cannot start again until the game ends. The other one is you can keep clicking this button many times, which will create many alerts, because every time you click it, it increments and move you towards the end game. So those buttons should not be clickable or accessible unless for the user to make a selection, then they should not be accessible anymore. And these will be the enhancements that we will do in the next iteration. For now, let's commit and push. So added the statistics and completed iteration 9.